Atlantic Ocean, 200 miles off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, January 18, 1942, 0300 hours, and Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Hardigan stands in the conning tower of U-123, watching through his binoculars as the lights of the American coastline sparkle like diamonds against the darkness. The lights are so bright, so abundant, that Hardigan can barely believe what he's seeing. There is no blackout, no attempt to hide the silhouettes of merchant ships passing in front of the illuminated shore. The Americans, Hardigan realizes with a mixture of excitement and disbelief, have no idea what's coming. Within 6 hours, Hardigan will fire the first torpedo of Operation Paukenschlag, Operation Drumbeat, into the British tanker Coimbra, sending 10,000 tons of heating oil to the bottom, along with 36 men who never saw death approaching in the darkness. And in the months that follow, German U-boats will sink more ships off America's eastern seaboard and Gulf Coast than were destroyed at Pearl Harbor, turning American waters into what German submariners will call their second happy time, a hunting ground so target-rich that some U-boat commanders will describe it as shooting fish in a barrel. But what Hardigan cannot possibly know, what no German naval officer suspects in these early months of 1942, is that somewhere along this coast, hidden in plain sight, there exists something that will haunt American naval intelligence for decades after the war ends. Something that will spawn investigations, declassified documents, and endless speculation. The possibility of a secret German submarine base on American soil, a facility that may have allowed U-boats to resupply, refuel, and continue their deadly work without making the dangerous journey back across the Atlantic. And the most unsettling part is that despite decades of searching, despite countless investigations and Freedom of Information Act requests, America has never conclusively proven whether this base existed or where it might have been. The concept of a secret U-boat base on or near American shores sounds like something from a spy novel, but the reality of German submarine operations in American waters during World War II provides the foundation for why such a base would have been both strategically brilliant and operationally possible. Admiral Karl Donitz, the mastermind behind German submarine warfare and the man who would eventually succeed Hitler as Führer, understood better than anyone that the key to winning the Battle of the Atlantic was not just sinking ships, but maintaining a constant presence in enemy waters. When Donitz planned Operation Drumbeat in late 1941, he knew that the greatest limitation on his U-boats was their operational range and the time required to sail from their bases in occupied France across the Atlantic, conduct their attacks, and return home. A Type 9 submarine, the long-range variant used for American operations, could stay at sea for about 12 weeks, but nearly half that time was spent simply crossing the Atlantic. If U-boats could refuel and resupply closer to their hunting grounds, they could spend far more time attacking Allied shipping and far less time in transit. This was the logic that would lead to the development of submarine supply ships, the so-called Milchkuh or milk cows, Type 14 U-boats, specially designed to carry fuel, torpedoes, and provisions to resupply attack submarines at sea. But submarine-to-submarine refueling was dangerous, time-consuming, and could only be conducted in calm seas far from enemy aircraft. A hidden shore base, even a primitive one, would have been infinitely more efficient. And the geography of the American coastline, particularly in the southeastern United States, provided numerous locations where such a base might have existed. The coastal waters of Louisiana, with their maze of bayous and channels, the remote barrier islands of North Carolina's Outer Banks, the mangrove forests and keys of southern Florida, all offered potential hiding places for submarines seeking shelter and resupply. American naval intelligence during the war received numerous reports, many from civilian fishermen and Coast Guard patrols, of U-boats surfacing in shallow coastal waters, of submarines spotted near abandoned oil platforms in the Gulf of Mexico, and of mysterious nighttime activity in remote coastal areas. Most of these reports were dismissed at the time as hysteria or misidentification, but some were taken seriously enough to generate classified investigations that continued long after the war ended. The story that would become the foundation for decades of speculation about a secret U-boat base begins in the Gulf of Mexico in the summer of 1942. Between May and September of that year, German submarines sank 56 Allied ships and damaged 14 more in Gulf waters, creating a maritime disaster that the US government worked desperately to keep secret. The effectiveness of these attacks was stunning, and they raised immediate questions about how U-boats were managing to operate so effectively, so far from their home bases. Type 9 submarines operating from Lorient, Brest, or Saint-Nazaire in occupied France had to travel roughly 4,500 nautical miles just to reach the Gulf of Mexico, and this journey alone consumed a substantial portion of their fuel. The standard fuel capacity of a Type 9 allowed for about 13,850 nautical miles of travel at cruising speed, but combat operations, high-speed chases, and evasive maneuvers all consumed fuel at a far greater rate. Yet U-boats were spending weeks patrolling Gulf waters, attacking ships night after night, and still managing to return safely to France. The mathematics of this seemed to suggest that either the U-boats were far more fuel efficient than American intelligence believed, or they were finding ways to refuel closer to their operational areas. Intelligence reports from this period, many of which were classified for more than 40 years after the war, described numerous incidents that suggested U-boats had established some form of shore support. In July 1942, a Louisiana fisherman reported seeing a submarine surface near an abandoned oil rig in the Gulf, remaining stationary for several hours before submerging and departing. The report was investigated by the Coast Guard, but by the time patrol boats arrived at the location, the submarine was gone and no evidence of its presence remained. In August 1942, residents of Grand Isle, Louisiana, reported hearing what sounded like heavy machinery operating at night from the direction of the marshlands to the west of the barrier island. Coast Guard investigators found tire tracks and disturbed vegetation in an area accessible only by boat, but no other evidence. The investigation was closed as inconclusive. In September 1942, a constable on the Texas coast reported exchanging gunfire with armed men who fled in a small boat toward a submarine visible in the offshore darkness. This report was immediately classified, and the constable was told never to speak of the incident. The report itself didn't emerge until 1987, when it was discovered in declassified Navy archives. These incidents, individually, could be explained away as misidentification, imagination, or exaggeration, but collectively, they suggested a pattern that deeply concerned American naval intelligence. If U-boats were making landfall, or even coming close to shore to meet with support personnel, it meant that the coastal waters were far less secure than the Navy wanted to admit. The most compelling evidence for a secret shore facility comes from post-war interrogations of German U-boat crews. Between 1945 and 1947, American and British intelligence officers conducted extensive debriefings of captured German submariners, and several of these interrogation transcripts contain tantalizing references to shore support operations in American waters. A former supply officer from U-507, captured after his submarine was sunk off Brazil in 1943, told interrogators that certain U-boats operating in the Gulf had been provided with what he described as emergency resupply coordinates, locations where submarines in desperate need of fuel or provisions could make contact with support elements. The officer claimed he had never used these coordinates himself, but had seen them referenced in sealed orders carried by certain U-boat commanders. When pressed for details, the officer said the locations were somewhere along the Gulf Coast, possibly in Louisiana or Texas, but he had never seen the actual coordinates and could provide no specific information. Another interrogation, of a radio operator from U-171, contained an even more intriguing reference. The operator stated that during his submarine's patrol in the Gulf in 1942, they had received encoded radio transmissions on frequencies that were not standard Kriegsmarine channels. These transmissions, which the operator could not decode as they were intended only for the captain's eyes, came from what the operator believed were shore-based transmitters based on the signal strength and characteristics. The operator told interrogators that after one of these transmissions, the captain had altered course toward the Louisiana coast and the submarine had surfaced in shallow water, where they remained stationary for several hours before departing. The operator claimed he never saw what happened during this time, as non-essential crew were ordered below decks, but he heard what sounded like another vessel coming alongside. These interrogation transcripts, discovered in the National Archives in the 1980s, have been analysed extensively by naval historians, and while they don't provide proof of a shore base, they certainly suggest that some form of shore support operation may have existed. The most persistent rumours about a secret U-boat base centre on two specific locations, both in Louisiana. The first is the marshlands around Delacroix Island, roughly 20 miles southeast of New Orleans, a remote area of bayous, swamps, and waterways that even today remains largely inaccessible except by boat. During the war, this area was even more isolated, inhabited only by a handful of fishermen and trappers who lived in stilt houses scattered throughout the marsh. In the late 1970s, a researcher named Jared Carter began investigating local stories about German submarines in the Delacroix area. Carter interviewed elderly residents who had lived in the area during the war, and several told remarkably consistent stories about seeing a submarine, not once, but multiple times, entering the waterways near their homes. One fisherman, speaking anonymously because he feared ridicule, described watching a submarine navigate through the marsh channels at night, following a route that required intimate knowledge of the local waters. The fisherman claimed the submarine surfaced near what he believed was a support vessel, possibly a converted fishing boat, and remained in the area for several hours before departing toward the open Gulf. The fisherman told Carter he had reported the sighting to authorities at the time, but was told to keep quiet about it for national security reasons. Another resident described finding German cigarette packages and what appeared to be German military rations washed up in the marsh after a storm in the summer of 1942. The resident had brought these items to the Coast Guard station in New Orleans, where they were confiscated, and the resident was questioned extensively about where exactly the items had been found. The resident was then told, in no uncertain terms, never to speak about the incident. Carter's research, published in a small regional history journal in 1983, attracted the attention of the FBI, which opened a file on Carter and questioned him about his sources. This unusual federal interest in what appeared to be merely historical research has itself become part of the evidence that something significant may have occurred in the Delacroix marshes during the war. The second location, frequently mentioned in connection with a secret U-boat base, is even more intriguing because it involves an established military facility. Fort Livingston, built in the 1830s on Grande-Terre Island at the mouth of Barataria Bay, was abandoned by the Army in 1869 but was briefly reactivated during World War II as a coastal observation post. The fort, accessible only by boat and surrounded by marshlands and shallow waterways, would have been an ideal location for a clandestine operation, precisely because of its official military status. Supplies and personnel coming and going would not have attracted suspicion, and the remote location provided natural concealment. In 1989, a former Army officer who had been stationed at Fort Livingston in 1942 came forward with an extraordinary claim. The officer, who was terminally ill and wanted to tell his story before he died, stated that in August 1942 he had been ordered to lead a small detachment to a location in the marshes south of the fort. There, in a narrow channel barely visible from the air, the officer claimed he saw a German submarine partially concealed by camouflage netting. The officer stated that he and his men were ordered to provide security, while personnel from the submarine came ashore and met with unidentified civilians. The entire operation lasted less than 2 hours, after which the submarine departed and the officer and his men were returned to Fort Livingston. Upon their return, the officer stated, he and his men were immediately debriefed by intelligence officers who had arrived from New Orleans. The officer and his men were ordered to sign secrecy agreements and told that discussing the incident with anyone, even their families, would result in court-martial. The officer claimed he had kept silent for 47 years, but felt compelled to tell the truth before his death. His account was investigated by researcher David MacDonald, who found that the officer's service records confirmed his presence at Fort Livingston during the relevant time period, and that intelligence officers from the Office of Naval Intelligence had indeed visited the fort in August 1942, though the purpose of their visit was not recorded. The officer's account has never been verified, and skeptics point out that a dying man's deathbed confession is hardly reliable evidence. But it fits a pattern of similar stories from the Gulf Coast, stories that share common elements: remote locations, nighttime operations, strict secrecy orders, and intelligence officer involvement. If even a fraction of these accounts are true, they suggest that something extraordinary was happening in Gulf Coast waters during the summer of 1942. The question of why the US government would allow a German submarine to make contact with shore-based support is one that has puzzled researchers for decades. The most plausible explanation involves counterintelligence operations, and the possibility that American intelligence was not merely observing German operations, but actively participating in them as part of a deception campaign.
During World War II, the double-cross system, operated by British intelligence, successfully turned captured German agents into double agents, who fed false information back to Germany. It's possible that a similar operation was conducted in the United States, where German support networks were allowed to operate under surveillance, providing intelligence about German operations while feeding false information back to German Naval Command. Declassified documents from the FBI's German intelligence operations during the war show that the Bureau was aware of and monitoring several suspected German support networks operating along the Gulf Coast. These networks, which included German nationals who had lived in the United States before the war and sympathetic American citizens, were believed to be providing information to U-boats about shipping movements and coastal defenses. Rather than immediately arresting these individuals, the FBI chose to monitor their activities, hoping to identify the full extent of the network and potentially use it for counterintelligence purposes. It's conceivable that this strategy extended to actually allowing limited support operations for U-boats, operations that would be carefully controlled and monitored to gain intelligence about German submarine tactics and capabilities. Such an operation would have required absolute secrecy, even within the military, which would explain why so few records exist and why personnel involved were sworn to silence. The alternative explanation is simpler, but no less troubling. It's possible that in the chaotic first months after Pearl Harbor, when the US military was desperately trying to organize coastal defenses with inadequate resources, German submarines did succeed in establishing improvised supply points along the coast. And the US military either didn't detect these operations or detected them but lacked the resources to stop them. The coastal areas where U-boat activity was most concentrated were vast, remote, and impossible to patrol effectively with the limited forces available in 1942. The Coast Guard, responsible for coastal security, had been gutted by budget cuts during the Depression, and most of its vessels and aircraft had been immediately transferred to convoy escort duty in the Atlantic when war broke out. Local police and sheriff departments along the Gulf Coast had no training or equipment for military operations. It's entirely possible that small teams of German sailors or German agents operating from submarines could have established temporary supply caches in remote locations, using local knowledge and careful planning to avoid detection. What makes this scenario plausible is that we know for certain that German submarines did land saboteurs on American shores on multiple occasions. Operation Pastorius in June 1942 put 8 German agents ashore at Amagansett, New York, and Ponte Vedra Beach, Florida. While the operation was a spectacular failure, with all agents quickly captured, it demonstrated that German submarines could approach the American coast close enough to use rubber boats to land personnel. If submarines could land saboteurs, they could certainly land supply teams or make contact with shore-based support elements. The final German submarine landing on American soil occurred in November 1944, when U-1230 put 2 agents ashore at Frenchman's Bay, Maine. These were only the operations we know about because the participants were captured. How many other landings might have occurred that were never detected or never reported? The technical requirements for a secret submarine supply operation are less daunting than they might initially appear. A U-boat didn't need a massive concrete bunker like those built in France. All it really needed was a secluded anchorage, preferably in water deep enough to allow the submarine to remain surfaced, but shallow enough to provide some protection from detection by aircraft. Access to fuel and provisions that could be delivered by small boats, and a way to communicate with shore-based contacts to arrange rendezvous times. The Louisiana and Texas coasts provided numerous locations that met these requirements. The bayous and channels that wind through the coastal marshes were deep enough for a submarine drawing about 15 feet of water, especially at high tide. These waterways were invisible from the air unless you knew exactly where to look, screened by thick vegetation and accessible only through narrow passes that appeared on no published charts. A submarine could navigate into these areas using a local pilot, refuel from drums of diesel brought out by fishing boats, take on provisions, and be back in deep water within a few hours. The fuel itself would not have been difficult to obtain. The Gulf Coast was, and is, dominated by the petroleum industry. Diesel fuel was available everywhere, used by fishing boats, tugboats, and industrial equipment. A few hundred gallons of diesel disappearing from a tank farm or being sold to supposed fishing boat operators would never have been noticed, or if noticed, would never have been connected to German submarines. The provisions required by a U-boat crew, roughly 50 men, were substantial but not impossible to obtain.
Canned goods, flour, sugar, coffee, fresh fruit and vegetables, and cigarettes could all be purchased in quantity without arousing suspicion, especially if spread across multiple purchases in different locations. The men doing the purchasing wouldn't even need to be German. They could be American citizens sympathetic to Germany, or simply individuals willing to sell supplies for cash without asking questions.
The Gulf Coast in 1942 still had an active smuggling culture, a holdover from Prohibition, and the channels and contacts used for smuggling liquor could easily be repurposed for smuggling supplies to submarines. Communication between submarines and shore-based contacts would have been the most challenging aspect of such an operation, but far from impossible. German submarines carried sophisticated radio equipment, capable of receiving and transmitting over long distances. Short-range radio signals from shore-based transmitters could easily reach submarines operating within 50 miles of the coast. These transmissions could use simple codes, or even appear to be routine commercial traffic. A fishing report broadcast on a particular frequency at a particular time could contain embedded information about rendezvous locations and times. The Germans had extensive experience with this type of covert communication, having operated spy networks throughout Europe and South America. Establishing similar communications in the United States would have been well within their capabilities. The more we examine the technical and logistical requirements, the more feasible a secret U-boat supply operation appears. Which raises the obvious question: if such operations were possible and potentially were conducted, why has no definitive proof ever been found? The answer may lie in the nature of the operations themselves and the circumstances surrounding the end of the war. If German submarine support operations in American waters existed, they would have been small-scale, temporary, and carefully concealed. Physical evidence would have been minimal and deliberately destroyed. A few fuel drums in a marsh, a cache of supplies in an abandoned building, camouflage netting draped over vegetation. All of this could be removed or would decay naturally within months. The people involved, both German personnel and any American collaborators, would have had powerful incentives to remain silent after the war. German submariners knew that admitting to operations on American soil could result in war crimes charges. American citizens who provided aid to German submarines faced prosecution for treason. Intelligence officers who might have been aware of or involved in monitoring these operations were bound by secrecy oaths that remained in effect long after the war ended. Documents relating to these operations, if they existed, would have been classified at the highest levels and may remain classified to this day. The US government has repeatedly declined Freedom of Information Act requests for certain World War II-era documents relating to German submarine activity in American coastal waters, citing ongoing national security concerns. This classification, more than 80 years after the events in question, has only fueled speculation about what those documents might contain. Some researchers believe the documents are being withheld not because they reveal anything about German operations, but because they reveal embarrassing details about American failures to secure the coast, or about controversial intelligence operations that violated American law. Others believe the documents, if they exist, would confirm that German submarines did establish temporary supply operations on American soil, a fact the government considers too embarrassing to admit, even after all these years. The most tantalizing clue about a potential U-boat base came in 2001, not from archives or interviews, but from the Gulf of Mexico itself. That year, researchers using side-scan sonar to survey the Gulf floor for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management discovered an anomaly in shallow water off the Louisiana coast. The sonar images showed what appeared to be a regular pattern of objects on the sea floor, objects that did not match any known natural formation or recorded shipwreck. Further investigation revealed that the objects appeared to be fuel drums, dozens of them, arranged in a pattern suggesting they had been deliberately placed rather than randomly lost overboard. The drums were in approximately 30 feet of water, close enough to shore to be accessible by small boats, but deep enough to be invisible from the surface. Carbon dating and analysis of marine growth suggested the drums have been on the seafloor since approximately the 1940s. The discovery was reported in technical literature but attracted little public attention. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which controls access to offshore areas, has declined requests to conduct further investigation of the site, stating that the drums pose no environmental hazard and that disturbing them would be unnecessarily costly.
but researchers who have studied the sonar images note several intriguing details. The drums appear to be arranged in groups, suggesting multiple trips to the site. The location of the drums, in a channel that would have been navigable by a submarine at high tide, is consistent with their use as an improvised fuel cache. Most significantly, the type of drums visible in the sonar images appears to match German military fuel drums of the World War II era, with reinforcing rings and a distinctive top configuration. While this evidence is far from conclusive, it's exactly the kind of physical trace one would expect to find if submarines had been using an improvised supply point. Fuel drums cached underwater for later retrieval, missed during the cleanup after the war, slowly sinking into the sediment where they remain hidden for 60 years. The historical record of German U-boat operations in American waters makes it clear that these submarines were far more active and effective than the American public was told during or immediately after the war. Between January 1942 and May 1945, German submarines sank more than 400 ships in waters off the American coast and in the Gulf of Mexico. These sinkings claimed more than 5,000 lives and sent millions of tons of shipping to the bottom. The U-boats operated with such effectiveness that Admiral Donitz, in his memoirs written after the war, described American waters in 1942 as the most target-rich environment his submarines encountered during the entire war. For the first 6 months of Operation Drumbeat, U-boats sank ships faster than American and British shipyards could replace them. If the trend had continued, it could have seriously impacted the Allied war effort, delaying or even preventing the build-up of forces necessary for the invasion of North Africa and eventually Europe. The turning point came in the summer of 1942, when the US Navy finally implemented convoy systems for coastal shipping and began to establish effective air patrols over the coastal waters. The introduction of blimps based at stations along the coast proved particularly effective, as these aircraft could patrol for hours, maintaining visual surveillance over vast areas of ocean. Ships travelling in convoy, protected by armed escorts, proved far more difficult to attack than the isolated merchants that had been easy prey in the early months of the campaign. By late 1942, U-boat effectiveness in American waters had declined dramatically, and Admiral Donitz began pulling submarines out of the area, redeploying them to the mid-Atlantic where convoys were still vulnerable. But during those critical months when U-boats were operating virtually unopposed off American shores, if ever there was a time when shore-based support operations would have been attempted, it was then. The legacy of German submarine operations in American waters extends far beyond the ships sunk and lives lost. The U-boat campaign forced fundamental changes in how America understood homeland security, revealing that geographic isolation was no longer a guarantee of safety. The experience of having enemy warships operate freely in American waters, sometimes within sight of American beaches, was a profound psychological shock. For decades after the war, the government downplayed the extent of U-boat operations, partly to avoid embarrassment, and partly because admitting the full scope of the German submarine campaign would have required admitting serious failures in coastal defense. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s, as classified documents were gradually released and survivors began speaking publicly, that the full story of the U-boat war off America's coast began to emerge. Even now, there are gaps in the historical record, incidents that were never fully investigated, reports that were filed and forgotten, and questions that remain unanswered. The question of whether a secret German submarine base existed on American soil may never be definitively answered. The evidence is circumstantial, consisting of scattered reports, suspicious incidents, tantalizing references in interrogation transcripts, and physical traces that could have alternative explanations. But the absence of definitive proof doesn't mean these operations didn't occur. It may simply mean that those involved, on both sides, did their jobs well. A truly secret base would be one that left no trace, involved only people with powerful reasons to keep silent, and was documented, if at all, in records that remain locked away in classified archives. The more we learn about World War II, the more we discover operations and activities that remained hidden for decades. The Manhattan Project, involving thousands of people and multiple massive facilities, remained secret until the atomic bomb was actually used. The breaking of the Enigma code at Bletchley Park wasn't publicly revealed until the 1970s. The extent of Soviet espionage in the American government wasn't fully understood until the Venona transcripts were declassified in the 1990s. If the United States could keep the existence of the atomic bomb secret, if Britain could conceal the breaking of Enigma for 30 years, and if Soviet spies could operate at the highest levels of government without detection, then surely a small-scale submarine support operation on a remote stretch of coast could remain hidden, especially if powerful interests wanted it to stay hidden.
The story of the secret submarine base that America never found is ultimately a story about the fog of war, about the things that happen in conflict that are never recorded, never officially acknowledged, and never fully understood. It's a story about the limits of what we can know about the past, even with access to archives and decades of research. And it's a reminder that World War II, for all the books written and documentaries produced, still holds secrets. Somewhere in the marshes of Louisiana or along the barrier islands of Texas, there may be rusting fuel drums or rotted pilings, or some other trace of an operation that was never supposed to have existed. Or perhaps there's nothing at all, and the rumours and reports were nothing more than wartime hysteria and post-war speculation. But for those who have studied the evidence, who have interviewed the survivors, who have combed through the declassified documents and walked the remote coastlines where U-boats once prowled, the question remains open. Did German submarines establish temporary supply bases on American soil during World War II? The careful academic answer is that we don't know. The gut answer, based on the cumulative weight of circumstantial evidence, is that something happened in those waters. Something that involved submarines and shore-based contacts. Something that the government decided was better left unacknowledged. Admiral Dönitz, interrogated extensively after the war, was specifically asked about submarine support operations in American waters. His answer, recorded in multiple interrogation transcripts, was carefully worded. He stated that German submarines operating in American waters relied primarily on their own fuel capacity and were resupplied at sea by submarine tankers when necessary. He made no mention of shore-based support. But Dönitz was an intelligent, careful man who had survived the Nazi regime by understanding what to say and what to leave unsaid. His answer addressed the question asked without volunteering additional information. He didn't say shore-based support didn't exist. He simply didn't talk about it. In the decades since the war, researchers have interviewed hundreds of German U-boat veterans, and most have been remarkably forthcoming about their experiences. They talk about the terror of depth charge attacks, the claustrophobia of life in a submarine, the guilt over ships sunk and sailors killed. But when asked about operations close to American shores, about contacts with shore-based elements, about supply operations that didn't involve submarine tankers, many become vague or claim not to remember. This reticence is notable because these same men can recall with perfect clarity events from 80 years ago, the names of crewmates, the specific dates of patrols, the exact locations of attacks. But ask about what happened in a Louisiana bayou or off a Texas barrier island, and suddenly memory becomes uncertain. This selective forgetfulness is itself a kind of answer, a silence that suggests something worth being silent about. The secret German submarine base that America never found may not have been a base at all in the traditional sense. It may have been nothing more than a few barrels of fuel cached in a marsh, a fishing boat operator willing to sell supplies without asking questions, a stretch of deep water where a submarine could surface safely under the cover of darkness. But in the context of submarine warfare, where every hour on station meant another opportunity to sink an enemy ship, even a primitive support operation could have made the difference between mission failure and success. If German submarines were able to extend their patrols in American waters by even a few days through improvised resupply, that would have represented a significant tactical advantage, and it would have been an operation worth keeping secret, then and now. The story of the secret base is ultimately less about concrete and steel, less about dramatic discoveries or smoking gun documents, and more about the nature of war itself. War creates situations where normal rules don't apply, where people do things they would never ordinarily do, where secrets are kept not just from the enemy, but from future historians and the public itself. The waters off Louisiana and Texas, the marshes and bayous and barrier islands where U-boats once hunted, have long since returned to normal. Fishermen work the same waters where submarines once surfaced in the darkness. Tourist boats cruise past locations where depth charges once exploded and merchant ships burned. The physical traces of the U-boat war have been erased by time and tide, and the deliberate efforts of those who wanted no reminder of those desperate months. But the questions remain, persistent and unanswerable,
at least with the evidence currently available.
Did German submarines establish supply operations on American soil? Was there a secret base, however primitive, that allowed U-boats to extend their deadly patrols? Did the US government know about these operations and choose to keep them secret? We may never know for certain. The people who could answer these questions are gone, and if documents exist that could provide proof, they remain locked away, possibly forever. But the absence of answers doesn't diminish the importance of the questions. If nothing else, the story of the secret submarine base serves as a reminder that official histories are incomplete, that classified documents may contain truths that contradict public narratives, and that what we think we know about the past may be only part of the story. Somewhere in the National Archives, in a filing cabinet that hasn't been open in decades, or in a military repository that refuses Freedom of Information Act requests on national security grounds, there may be a document that answers all these questions. A report from a Coast Guard patrol that saw too much, an intelligence assessment that detailed German support operations, a debriefing of a German prisoner who decided to tell the truth. That document may never be released. It may have been destroyed long ago, judged too sensitive to preserve. Or it may simply be lost, filed incorrectly or misfiled deliberately, buried in millions of pages of wartime records where it will never be found. The secret German submarine base that America never found may ultimately be a secret that will never be revealed. A piece of history that remains forever in the shadows, known only to those who were there and who carried their knowledge to the grave. And perhaps that's fitting. War is full of secrets. Some are eventually revealed. Others remain hidden forever. The submarine base, if it existed, was built on secrecy and maintained through silence. It's only appropriate that secrecy and silence should be its legacy. For the residents of the Gulf Coast who remember the summer of 1942, who remember the night sky lit by burning tankers, who remember the oil that washed up on beaches and the bodies that came ashore, who remember the fear and the rumours and the whispered stories of submarines in the bayous, the question of whether there was a secret base is less important than the reality they lived through. They know what they saw, what they experienced, what they were told never to speak about. History may question their memories, official records may deny their accounts, but they remember, and in the end, memory may be the only evidence that matters, the only proof we'll ever have that something extraordinary happened in those waters, something that has never been fully explained and may never be fully understood. The secret German submarine base that America never found remains what it has always been, a mystery wrapped in secrecy, defended by silence and protected by time. Perhaps it's better that way. Some secrets, once revealed, lose their power, but secrets that remain hidden, that tantalize us with possibilities and frustrate us with their elusiveness, those secrets continue to fascinate, to provoke questions, and to remind us that we don't know everything, that history still has surprises, and that the past is not as settled as we like to believe.